Hello, and welcome to a Jesus Followers 30-Year Journey to Judaism podcast, an audio adaptation of the memoir of similar name. I am your host and the author, J.S. Clark. In this podcast, I will be reading for you the story of my growing up as a sincere follower of the Nazarene and the questions that led me to the old path of the Jewish people. With the help of the Almighty, on with the show. Chapter: Jews will be Jews. Looking back, I find that I stumble over a notion, like a rock on a racetrack, and I will keep coming around the track back to the same notion and stumbling over it again until I finally pick it up. In this case, understand that what led me to this Messianic Kehilat HaMashiach, which was in fact mostly Gentile, was not a love of the Jewish people, but a love of Torah. I did not particularly care that what I was doing was Jewish or not Jewish. In the depth of my heart, Jewishness actually bothered me a bit. What, I wasn't good enough because I didn't sprinkle enough Yiddish in my conversation? But it would be years before I understood how deeply I resented it. In that period, around 1998 to 2001, I accepted that my external cultural metamorphosis was the necessary polishing of the Jewish lens through which the scriptures were correctly understood. As a follower of Jesus, I rarely saw Jesus followers consider how culture bore on the understanding of a sacred text. In literal Spanish, if I told you that I was pulling someone's hair, you would think I was a girl in a catfight. But actually, this is an idiom for fooling someone, or as country people would say, pulling someone's leg. A fitting phrase because it implies tripping them up. Or in Australia, a man like Ken Ham might ask an unmarried virgin American if she would like to nurse a baby. She would be embarrassed because she is understanding the question as her being asked to breastfeed a stranger's kid. But in his vernacular, he is simply asking if she wants to hold the baby. Idioms demonstrate what should be obvious, that culture affects the meaning of words. Thus, with Scripture, the formation of doctrine. We have already seen one example in the case of the day that no man knows. There it was a clue, not a resignation to absolute mystery. Another example would be baptism. Jesus' followers have the idea that Yeshua came along with a bag full of completely new and alien ideas that none of the Jewish sages had ever entertained. The fostering of this idea makes perfect sense in light of the Church's long frustration with Jewish rejection. If the ancient sages possessed any scriptural understanding or wisdom, then naturally one would have to ask why they did not accept Yeshua. Why would they have been so close-minded if their minds were actively and honestly employed? But if they only repeated mindless tradition that had sprung aberrantly from their fathers' vain imaginations, then naturally there would be no reason to ask why the sages opposed following Yeshua. When it comes to baptism, Jesus' followers think that Jesus was instituting one such new idea. But consider the priests and Levites who came to see John the Baptist, who I will refer to as Yochanan the Immerser. Yochanan 1:19-25 says that they came asking who he was and why he was baptizing. They did not ask, "What is this that you are doing?" Rather, why was he doing it? This shows the idea was not strange to them. An easy internet search will tell you this plainly. Baptism is descended from the pre-existing Jewish practice of the mikvah. This means that baptism already existed. Yochanan and Yeshua were not instituting something alien, but using something that was already culturally accepted. Thus, baptism already had a meaning, and surprisingly, this meaning was not an identification with someone else's death. Mikvah was about washing away a previous period of your own life, making a break out of water between your present self and an old, profane, or common self. Modern Americans grasp the idea when they do something shameful and then feel like they need a shower. Water can have a cleansing spiritual effect, or at least a person has the sense that this is true. Physical cleaning somehow mirrors the desire for spiritual cleaning, and you see this in the Gospels. Yeshua tells Nicodemus he must be born again, which would have been understood as a reference to immersion, showing that immersion was about beginning a new life, but not centered on death. Besides the novelty for us of rediscovering a closer to original understanding, this means that Yeshua was continuing what was already established. Yeshua never claims to have come to start a new religion, but to begin the next stage, as it were, of the same. The Last Supper is another such example. Jesus' followers again think of this as a new idea. overlooking the fact that Luke's description of multiple cups, Luke 22:17, verse 20 and 42, and singing a hymn, Matthew 26:30, Mark 14:26, fits into the same Pesach, Passover, traditions that Jews inherit to this day. Some will debate whether the Last Supper was actually a Passover Seder, the ritual meal of Pesach observance. Some will say it was a rabbi's Seder that a rabbi might keep with his disciples, so they could enjoy the official Seder with their families. But it does not matter which of these options you choose to believe. In Matthew 26:17, Mark 14:12, and Luke 22:8, the disciples clearly understand that the supper is to commemorate the Pesach. Whether it was a symbolic one or a precise observance, the intent was Pesach. This means that observing the Last Supper, as Yeshua said to commemorate it, is an observance of Pesach. Probably that means it was meant to be once a year at Pesach, not weekly or monthly. Perhaps that is why the Catholic Church's only obligated communion is on Easter. Where do you suppose they got the idea that the obligation was once a year instead of every first day of the week? This would also tell you that the communion should be unleavened bread rather than a raised loaf. Score another one for the Catholics. It would also tell you that the wine should indeed be wine rather than grape juice, because in ancient Israel it would be impossible, because of spoilage, for there to be grape juice in the spring. Alcohol is the only way you can have grape juice 4 months after the harvest. Again, this reinforces that Yeshua was tying into Judaism, not tying off from it. Approaching Scripture from a Jewish perspective also gives light to teachings about an eye for an eye and not resisting evil. Many have struggled with self-defense because of theology insulated from Jewish contexts. I myself was a pacifist for a season. In Matthew 5:21 through 48, Yeshua repeats a certain phrase, "You have heard it said." Notice it does not say, "You have seen it written." This indicates he is talking about an oral tradition, a school of thought, rather than something written in Scripture. This is obvious for the most part. Does anyone argue that Yeshua is saying that Scripture is wrong when it says, "You shall not commit adultery"? No. Jesus' followers that I have met hold that in the case of adultery, Yeshua is raising the bar and saying that God's standard is higher than the written Torahs. Not that he is saying the prohibition against physical extramarital relations is set aside. Yet, when the same people get to the heard said relating to an eye for an eye, they believe Yeshua is directly annulling the commandment. But a Jewish perspective would inform that he is contradicting a commentary on the Scripture. Lacking a Jewish context, such Jesus followers are not in the same arena as the argument. And lacking Torah literacy, they are not even playing the same sport, because the whole eye for an eye discussion found in Shemot, Exodus 21:22 through 27, and Vayikra, Leviticus 24:19 through 20, is not about revenge at all, but about restitution. Think about how schizophrenic it would have to be to institute revenge mutilation in 2 passages, and yet also say not to even bear a grudge against one's brother. Vayikra 19:17. The Scripture in context is talking about the subject of restitution for damage done. Shemot says, "Give eye for eye, not take eye for eye." The rabbis gleaned from this and Vayikra that God is telling us that the debt we incur from permanently injuring someone is a debt that cannot be paid. If I take your eyesight, how can I give you my eyesight? Even if I could transplant my eyes, which they could not back then, how can I be sure that my sight is the equivalent to yours? What if my eyes see the same, but are different color? At the end of the day, my eyes can never be replacements for yours. It is a debt that cannot be paid. Yeshua's teaching in that context makes perfect sense. The other rabbis to whom he may have been responding might have been limiting their teaching to, the debt is unpayable, while Yeshua is saying, don't even respond to a minor insult, like a slap on the cheek. Absorb it and give them another chance, turn the other cheek, rather than risking putting yourself in a place of incurring an unpayable debt. In this context, it becomes obvious that Yeshua is addressing minor insults, even physical affronts, not lethal force. He does not say, if someone stabs you in your left kidney, offer him your right also. No, these are minor offenses. I could go on about the value of Jewish context and understanding, but the point should be apparent that viewing the Brit Chadashah, New Testament, from a Gentile Western perspective changes the meaning into some new, unattached, alien revelation. Viewing it from a Jewish perspective puts it in a natural line of succession with the Tanakh, the Old Testament. Too much Jewishness. But I was not always so comfortable and clear in my thinking. Through a series of events, I came to be disenchanted with Messianic Judaism, and even wounded by it. At the time, what would happen seemed like a disaster, and in some ways it was. I am still trying to make peace with those involved, but now I see it was just God bringing to the surface issues that I and others needed to deal with, and I think we did not receive that correction. Rather, insult and offense was perceived, and all sides failed to deal with it properly. What happened? The congregation's leadership was too centralized, in my view, and that of a dozen or so others. It seemed unaccountable. I see this differently, more Jewishly now, but at the time I was thinking from a Goy, Gentile, perspective. That cannot be entirely my fault, or Gentiles in general. How can we know what we do not know? You cannot be upset with a child who pulls your computer cord out of the wall, causing you to lose a morning's writing. He does not know any better. You cannot blame a Gentile for acting on Gentile thoughts. It is the Jew's job to be a light to the Gentile, not blame the Gentile for not being his own light. So this seemingly unaccountable leadership attempted to impose guidance on a couple's romantic relationship. I am not alluding to some explicit sin like adultery, but rather a judgment on the wisdom or pace or expression of affection. The situation escalated, and regular attendees started not coming. I got involved on the side of leadership, but soon found myself convinced that both parties had problems, and confronted both sides. I believe I handled this much better than at Medical Lake. The details are not terribly important, and honestly, I cannot remember how that meeting with the leadership turned out the way it did. In general, I was concerned that regular attendees kept disappearing, without even a "see ya," and that somehow led me to the perception of leadership being unaccountable. And somehow, in my mind, that connected to the Jewishness of the congregation. I opened with the Jewish prong because I felt that the congregational leadership was ignoring what the Gentiles had to offer. We often heard about the Jewish special calling in the world, and were inundated with Jewish terminology, even encouraged to use Hebrew equivalents instead of our own given names. Yes, I know that seems to be what I was praising a few pages back. God's story is hilarious at times. From my perspective now, I have little problem with any of that, really, except that the Gentiles were not being shown the framework under which the leadership was operating, and that could have been by design, though I doubt this was the intention. Churchgoers have learned to sit and receive instruction. The pastor ought to tell them what they need to know. But the deeper in Torah I have come, the more I realize that oftentimes instruction is the act of intentionally putting a stumbling block in someone's path, but not a blind person's. You should not teach someone something that they are not looking to apply. Thus, sometimes, and Yeshua did this often, a teacher does not fully explain things, but lets the one with the ears to hear seek it out. Thus, if the leadership were acting with Jewish design, and the congregation with good understanding, the situation should have stirred inquiry instead of complaint and resistance. But again, it is the Jew called to be the light. But back at that meeting, I do not think we ever got to the issue of leadership. The conversation got short-circuited by the Jewishness prong. I told the leadership that I had not come to the congregation because I had an emotional love for the Jewish people, or wanted to be a Gentile looking like a Jew. I came because I wanted to learn Torah. Leadership responded by saying, if I kept coming, I would be like a leper. In other words, do not come back. I did leave without further protest. Look, maturity! But I had been kind of a fixture for a couple of years, helping lead dances and do setup, so it was not long before other congregants started putting the pieces together. Similar and related issues continued to build steam, and I eventually got dragged back in. The situation got more and more dramatic, in bad ways, such that it is embarrassing to think about. The grieved parties broke off to worship in homes, but could not get along, so it amounted to friends worshiping with friends. But without leadership or vision, the people perish. About the same time, my personal relations were also in turmoil. Girls, heartbreak, the indignation of being fired from a job that I was quitting anyway, the general aimlessness of my career path. I did what any normal man in his 20s would do. I joined the United States Marine Corps. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like it, no one likes a tattletale, and it's my first podcast that I didn't record in my car on a phone, so go easy on me. If you really liked it and want to show support, feel free to visit J.S. Clark on Patreon. Or you can buy or recommend one of my books, including Finding Home, a Jesus follower's 30-year journey to Judaism, Available on Lulu, Amazon, and Smashwords. If you have questions or comments, reach me at jsclarkpresents@gmail.com. If it fits, I'll plug it into the show. I'm also to be found on X at jsclark5768 or Threads at jsclarkpresents. Lastly, more info and occasional updates at jsclarkwordcraftsman.net. All the best.